When I first met Janet, my mother-in-law, I didn't think much of the tension people often describe between wives and their husbands' mothers. I thought it was exaggerated. Or maybe just bad luck for some. Boy, was I wrong. Janet was always overbearing. To put it mildly, my husband, Dan, would laugh it off, saying she was just set in her ways, and that she'd come around once we started a family. But things didn't get better after we had Emily. They got worse. From the moment Emily was born, Janet inserted herself into every aspect of our lives. She showed up unannounced, dismissed every parenting decision I made, and acted as though she had more right to my daughter than I did. And when I tried to set boundaries, Janet would smile, nod, and completely ignore me. Dan was stuck in the middle. He tried to play peacemaker, but it felt like every time he stood up to his mother, he'd immediately backpedal, afraid to hurt her feelings. He was caught in this web of guilt, loyalty, and fear of confrontation. I'd always known their relationship was close, but I hadn't anticipated how much it would affect our marriage once Emily was in the picture. The final straw came when Emily turned 5. Emily was my world. I had read every book on parenting, every article, every blog post, and I knew I was protective, maybe too protective, if you ask some people. But after everything I went through to have her, the miscarriages, the emotional toll of fertility treatments, I had every reason to be. I wasn't about to take any chances with her health or well-being. Janet never saw it that way. She believed children needed to be toughened up. She thought my rules were too strict, and she never passed up an opportunity to tell me that, whether it was about bedtime, Emily's diet, or the way I limited her screen time. In her eyes, I was coddling Emily, raising her to be weak. That should have been my first warning sign. But, of course, you never think someone close to you, especially family, would deliberately hurt your child. It started innocently enough, or so I thought. Janet called one evening and asked if she could take Emily for the weekend. She was surprisingly cordial about it, and since Dan and I hadn't had a break in ages, we agreed. I hesitated at first, but Dan convinced me it would be fine. It's just for a couple of days, he said. Mom raised me, didn't she? Against my better judgment, I said yes. That Friday afternoon, Janet arrived with the same cheery smile she always wore when she was pretending to be on her best behavior. I packed Emily's things, her favorite stuffed animal, some books, and, of course, her medicine. Emily had been recovering from a mild cold, and though she was feeling better, I wanted to make sure she had what she needed just in case. As they left, a strange feeling washed over me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt off. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just being overly anxious. The next morning, I called Janet to check in on Emily. No answer. I called again in the afternoon. Still no answer. By evening, panic was setting in. Dan tried to calm me down, saying that Janet was probably just out with Emily and had her phone on silent. But my gut was telling me something else. It wasn't until Sunday morning that Janet finally returned my calls. I could hear Emily playing in the background, and she sounded fine. My anxiety eased, but something still didn't sit right with me. I asked Janet to bring her home early, but Janet brushed me off, saying, "Oh, don't be silly, she's having too much fun with Grandma." I clenched my teeth but let it go. When Emily came home that evening, she seemed tired but happy. And for a moment, I thought maybe I had been overreacting after all. Janet waved goodbye with her usual fake sweetness, and I promised myself I'd never let my paranoia get the best of me again. But by Monday morning, Emily had broken out in a rash. I'll never forget the sinking feeling in my stomach when I saw those red bumps covering her body. Chickenpox. I hadn't even thought to vaccinate her yet because she was due for her shot in a few weeks. But there it was, the unmistakable signs of the virus. My baby was sick. Dan and I rushed her to the doctor, and it was confirmed. Emily had chickenpox. I spent the next week nursing Emily through high fevers, intense itching, and sleepless nights. Every time she cried out in pain, my anger boiled a little hotter. I couldn't understand how she had caught it. No one we knew had chickenpox. I started making phone calls to daycare, friends, family, anyone Emily had been in contact with. Then, I remembered Janet. I called her immediately, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you know where Emily could have caught chickenpox? Was she around anyone sick while she was with you?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Janet spoke. Well, she was around little Tommy next door. He had it last week. But it's not a big deal. Kids should get chickenpox. Toughen 'em up. My blood ran cold. She knew Tommy had chickenpox. And she took Emily over there anyway. Deliberately. Janet, I said, my voice trembling with rage. You knew he was sick. And you still let Emily play with him? What were you thinking? Oh, don't be so dramatic, she scoffed. It's just chickenpox. She'll be fine. You're making a big fuss over nothing. I was speechless. How could she be so careless? No. It wasn't carelessness. It was intentional. She had done it on purpose. Janet believed children should get chickenpox naturally. That vaccines were unnecessary. She had been ranting about it ever since Emily was born. And now, she had gone behind my back, exposed my daughter to a disease, just to prove some ridiculous point. I hung up on her. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't think straight. I told Dan what had happened. And to my shock, he didn't seem as angry as I was. He tried to play it off, saying, it's chickenpox. I had it as a kid. You had it as a kid. She'll be fine. That's not the point. Dan, I shouted, your mother deliberately exposed our daughter to a disease. She went behind our backs. But Dan refused to see it that way. He said I was overreacting, that his mother meant no harm. He even tried to shift the blame onto me for not vaccinating Emily sooner. That was the beginning of the end for me. For the next few days, I couldn't look at Dan without feeling a deep sense of betrayal. How could he take his mother's side after what she had done? How could he dismiss my concerns like they didn't matter? Janet called me several times during the week, pretending to check on Emily. But I knew it was just to gloat. I couldn't bear to hear her voice, so I ignored her calls. Dan, of course, kept talking to her like nothing had happened. When Emily finally recovered, I made a decision. I couldn't trust Janet anymore, and if Dan wasn't going to back me up, then I had to take matters into my own hands. I sat Dan down one night and told him, point blank, that Janet was no longer welcome in our home, and she wouldn't be seeing Emily again without my supervision. He looked at me like I had slapped him. You can't be serious, he said. I am, I replied, my voice steady. She crossed a line. I won't let her endanger our daughter again. Dan tried to argue, but I had already made up my mind. This wasn't up for debate. In the months that followed, our marriage grew colder. Dan resented me for cutting his mother out of our lives, and I resented him for not supporting me. The tension between us was unbearable, and we fought constantly, but I didn't care. The only thing that mattered to me was protecting Emily. Janet tried to weasel her way back into our lives, sending gifts for Emily, showing up unannounced, but I held firm. Every time she came to the door, I turned her away. She would call Dan and cry about how I was keeping her from her granddaughter. But I didn't budge. In the end, it was Emily who suffered the most. She didn't understand why Grandma wasn't around anymore, and it broke my heart to see her confused and hurt. But I knew it was the right thing to do. Janet had crossed a line, and once trust is broken, it's almost impossible to repair. Dan and I eventually went to therapy, trying to salvage what was left of our marriage. It helped, but things were never quite the same. I still loved him, but the trust between us was fractured, just like the trust between me and his mother. Some might say I overreacted, that I should have forgiven Janet and moved on. But I'll never forget the sight of my daughter, covered in those red, itchy bumps, crying in pain, all because her grandmother wanted to prove a point. And I'll never forgive Janet for that. In the end, I learned that trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. My relationship with Dan remained strained, and while we found a way to coexist, things were never as they once were. As for Janet, she remained on the outskirts of our lives, a reminder of how deep betrayal can cut. Protecting Emily became my priority, no matter the cost to family ties. Sometimes, setting boundaries means walking away, even when it hurts, because no one should ever put your child at risk, not even family.